Hash 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 asterisk asterisk Part 1 Darkness on the Prairie asterisk asterisk. The Arizona sun was a merciless god. It beat down on the parched earth, baking the red dust until it rose in shimmering waves, blurring the line between the land and the sky. This was Elara Hayes' world, a small cattle ranch carved out of a landscape that gave little and took much. The mountains stood in the distance like silent, jagged sentinels, their stony faces flushed crimson in the late afternoon light. The wind, when it blew, offered no relief, only a dry, whispering voice that carried the scent of sagebrush and loneliness. It had been 2 years since Jacob was laid to rest in the small plot behind the cabin, under the lone cottonwood that somehow survived here. 2 years of silence. The silence was the hardest part. It filled the small, sturdy cabin he had built for them, seeped into the floorboards, and settled over her like a second skin. During the day, she could fight it. The work was a blessing, mending fences torn by coyotes, hauling water from the well until her shoulders ached, tending to the small herd of longhorns that were her only inheritance. The physical exhaustion was a shield against the hollowing ache in her chest. But when dusk bled across the prairie, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the silence returned. It was in these moments that her strength, the hard-won composure she wore like armor, began to crack. She would sit on the porch steps, a tin cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands, and watch the shadows lengthen, feeling the vast, crushing emptiness of the land around her. She was 24 years old, a widow in a land that had little use for a woman alone. The nearby town of Redemption was a 10-mile ride, a journey she made only when supplies ran desperately low. Redemption was a place of squinted eyes and pursed lips. The women, gathered outside the general store, would fall silent as she passed, their whispers following her like burrs on a saddle blanket. Asterisk too proud. That one. A woman's place ain't running a ranch by her lonesome. It ain't natural. Asterisk. The men were different, but no better. Their gazes were heavier, lingering on the curve of her hip or the line of her throat, stripped of courtesy and filled with a raw, speculative hunger. They saw a property, not a person, an opportunity. Sergeant Miller, the man in charge of the small army outpost, was the worst. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a lazy arrogance that made her skin crawl. He spoke of protection, his voice a low drawl that was more threat than promise. So she kept to herself, finding solace in the company of her stoic horse, Apollo, and the rhythmic creak of the porch swing. Yet, even in her self-imposed isolation, a deeper, more private truth churned within her. It was a longing she dared not name, a physical ache that the hard labor could not quell. It came to her in the dead of night, a warmth that spread through her limbs, a yearning for a touch that was not just memory. She would lie in the center of the large bed she had once shared with Jacob, the empty space beside her feeling as vast and cold as the prairie itself. The shame of this secret hunger was a constant companion, another ghost in her silent house. It was about 6 months ago that she first felt the sensation of being watched. It started as a subtle prickling on the back of her neck as she brought the cattle in for the night. She'd turn, scanning the ridge line, but see nothing but the stoic saguaro cacti, their arms raised to the heavens. She dismissed it as nerves, the kind of phantom feeling that solitude breeds. But it persisted. A twig would snap in the brush, too heavy for a rabbit, too deliberate for a deer. The cattle would sometimes grow restless for no reason, their lowing laced with an unfamiliar anxiety. Then, one evening, she saw him, or rather, a suggestion of him, a silhouette, tall and broad, standing motionless on the edge of her property where the scrubland met the rock-strewn hills. He was too far to make out any features, a figure cut from the deepening twilight. He stood for a long moment, a part of the landscape, before melting back into the shadows. He wasn't a settler. The stillness, the way he blended with the land, was not something a white man could learn. Apache. The words settled in her gut with a cold weight. The tensions along the border were a constant, simmering threat. Tales of raids and bloodshed were traded in town like currency, each story more gruesome than the last. The Apache were spoken of as specters, savage and inhuman. Yet, the presence she felt was not menacing. It was watchful, patient. She saw the silhouette a few more times over the following weeks, always in the same spot, always at dusk. A silent guardian she couldn't explain and didn't dare mention to anyone. Her lonely heart began to weave a strange fantasy around this shadow, a protector in the dark, the only living soul who seemed to notice her existence without judgment. The day had been brutally hot, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a storm that never came. As night fell, it brought no coolness, only a suffocating darkness. Alara had just finished securing the cattle in the small corral and was washing her face and hands with the water from the basin on the porch. The weariness in her bones was profound. It was nights like these when her loneliness felt sharpest, a blade twisting in her soul. The sound of hoofbeats startled her. More than one rider. They were coming fast, with a drunken, reckless rhythm that sent a jolt of fear through her. She quickly stepped inside the cabin, her hand going to the rifle she kept mounted above the fireplace. Peeking through the edge of the gingham curtain, she saw 3 men dismount. Her heart sank. It was Sergeant Miller, and with him were 2 of his corporals, their faces flushed and slack with whiskey. "Evening, Mrs." Hayes Miller called out, his voice thick and overly friendly. He swaggered toward the porch, his spurs jingling a discordant tune. "Just making our rounds. Seeing to the safety of the good folks in this territory." His men snickered, staying back by the horses but letting their eyes roam over the cabin, the corral, the darkness. They were like wolves, circling. Alara opened the door just enough to be seen, the heavy rifle held firmly in her hands. "I'm safe enough. Sergeant, there's no need." Miller's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, is that any way to greet the men who keep the savages from your door? We're parched from the trail. Surely a good Christian woman wouldn't deny a man a drink of water." It wasn't a request. The pretense of civility was paper thin. Her mind raced. To refuse would provoke him. To acquiesce would be to invite them closer. She chose the lesser of 2 evils, for now. "Stay on the porch," she said, her voice colder than she felt. "I'll bring you the water." She kept her eyes on them as she backed into the cabin, never turning away. She ladled water into 3 tin cups, her hands trembling slightly. When she returned, Miller had already seated himself on her porch swing, as if he owned the place. He took the cup from her, his fingers deliberately brushing against hers. The touch was repulsive, and she recoiled as if burned. "Mighty lonely out here for a pretty thing like you," he murmured, taking a long drink. "Husband's been gone a while now. A bed can get mighty cold on these Arizona nights." One of his men laughed. "A coarse, ugly sound. She needs someone to warm it for her. Sarge." Alara's grip on the rifle tightened, her knuckles turning white. "I think it's time for you to leave," she said, her voice low and shaking with a rage that momentarily eclipsed her fear. Miller set the cup down with a metallic clink. He rose slowly, his bulk seeming to fill the entire porch. "Now, that ain't hospitable. We're just making conversation." He took a step toward her. "Fact is, we've been worried about you. A woman alone is a temptation. To the Apache, to others, you need a man's protection." He took another step, closing the distance between them. The smell of whiskey and unwashed sweat filled the air, choking her. Her back was against the doorframe. She raised the rifle, the barrel level with his chest. "One more step," she whispered, "and I'll use this." For a moment, he froze, his eyes glinting with a mixture of surprise and cruel amusement. He didn't believe she would do it. He saw her as a frightened woman playing at being strong. His men had moved to the base of the steps, cutting off any escape. The night which had been filled with the chirping of crickets, fell utterly silent. And in that sudden, profound silence, he appeared. He didn't make a sound. One moment, the space between the porch and the woods was empty. The next, he was there. He was just a shape at first, emerging from the deep shadows like a spirit summoned from the earth itself. The moonlight caught him, and Alara's breath hitched. He was the shadow from the ridge. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders that seemed as wide as the cabin door. His black hair was long, held back from his face by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, the skin the color of rich, oiled copper. His face was all harsh angles and uncompromising strength, a face that spoke of enduring suns and bitter winds. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, fiercely intelligent, and fixed on Sergeant Miller with an intensity that was terrifying in its stillness. He held no weapon, yet his entire being was a weapon. Miller and his men had frozen, their drunken bravado vanishing like smoke. They turned slowly, and the sight of the Apache warrior standing not 20 yards away seemed to sober them instantly. This was no rumor from town. This was the living, breathing embodiment of all their fears. The Apache leader, Cale, said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, his presence an unassailable declaration of power. The air crackled with a tension that was 1,000 times more potent than the standoff with the rifle. In his silence was a promise of violence so swift and final it would be over before a man could scream. He took a single, deliberate step forward. That was all it took. One of the corporals let out a choked gasp and fumbled for his pistol. Miller shot him a venomous look. He knew. He was a bully and a coward. But he wasn't a fool. He knew they were hopelessly outmatched. This was not some cornered farmer. This was a king in his own domain. "We were just leaving," Miller stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. He didn't look at Alara. He couldn't take his eyes off the Apache. He backed away slowly, his hands held up in a placating gesture. No trouble here, just a misunderstanding. His men practically scrambled over each other to get to their horses, mounting with clumsy, panicked haste. Miller followed, casting one last terrified glance at the silent figure in the dark before spurring his horse into a desperate gallop. Their hoofbeats faded into the night, a frantic, fleeing rhythm. The silence that returned was different. It was heavy, alive. Alara stood on the porch, trembling, the rifle suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She lowered it, her eyes fixed on the man who had saved her. He was still there, watching her now. The ferocity in his gaze had softened, replaced by something she couldn't decipher, an ancient sorrow, a quiet intensity. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them across the dusty yard. In his eyes, she saw not a savage, but a man burdened by duty, and perhaps by a loneliness that mirrored her own. Then, as silently as he had come, he turned and stepped back into the shadows. He didn't vanish. He was simply absorbed by the night, becoming one with the darkness he commanded. Alara was alone again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was filled with the echo of his presence. The shadow on the prairie now had a face, a name she didn't know, and a purpose she was only beginning to understand. Standing on her porch, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the Arizona sky, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: her life, the small, quiet world she had built around her grief, had just been torn wide open. ###****, Part 2. The Stranger in the Lamplight. ****. The days following Sergeant Miller's hasty retreat were unnervingly quiet. Alara found herself scanning the ridge line not with apprehension, but with a strange, searching hope. The shadow was gone. The silent watcher had revealed himself and then withdrawn completely, leaving a void where his presence had been. The silence in the cabin returned, But it had changed. It was no longer just empty. It was expectant. She felt as if she were holding her breath, waiting for a sound she couldn't name. Miller and his men stayed away, and when she made her necessary trip to Redemption for flour and salt, the sergeant, standing outside the saloon, pointedly looked the other way. The whispers from the townswomen, however, seemed to have a new edge. They looked at her not just as a proud widow, but as something wilder, something tainted by the land she refused to abandon. She was a woman who lived too close to the border, too close to the savagery they all feared. They didn't know how right they were. A week later, the promised storm finally broke. It came without warning, a bruised purple stain that spread across the afternoon sky, swallowing the sun. The wind howled first, a mournful cry that rattled the cabin's single window pane. Then came the rain, not a gentle shower, but a torrential downpour, a solid sheet of water that turned the dusty yard into a roiling sea of red mud. Elara secured the shutters and lit the lantern, its warm, golden glow pushing back against the tumultuous gray world outside. The sound of the storm was a deafening roar, isolating her completely. It was a comfort. In a way, the storm was so loud, so powerful, it drowned out the silence and the endless churn of her own thoughts. She sat by the small hearth, nursing a cup of tea, the heat a welcome antidote to the damp chill that had seeped into the cabin. Apollo was safe in his stable, and the cattle were huddled in their lean-to. There was nothing to do but wait for the tempest to pass. Hours passed. The fury of the storm did not abate. If anything, it grew stronger. A sudden violent crack of thunder shook the cabin to its foundations, and the lantern flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. It was in the momentary quiet that followed the thunderclap that she heard it. A sound at the door. It wasn't the wind. It was too solid, too deliberate, a soft, firm rap of knuckles against wood. Her heart leaped into her throat. Her first thought was Miller, emboldened by the storm, thinking her trapped and helpless. She reached for the rifle above the fireplace, her hands slick with a sudden sweat. The knock came again, patient but insistent. It did not sound like a drunken soldier. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against the rough-hewn planks. She could hear nothing over the roar of the rain. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, only the storm. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she clutched the rifle, unlatched the heavy bar, and pulled the door inward just a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her grasp. Rain lashed her face, cold and stinging. And there he was, Cale, the Apache chief. He was not a shadow now. He was terrifyingly real. Standing on her small porch, drenched and illuminated by the flickering lantern light spilling from the doorway. The rain had plastered his long black hair to his skin, running in rivulets down the hard planes of his face and over the powerful muscles of his chest and shoulders. He wore the same buckskin leggings, dark and heavy with water. He was unarmed, his hands empty at his sides. He did not move, simply stood there, letting the storm rage around him as if it were of no consequence. His eyes found hers through the deluge. They were as dark and deep as the storm-racked night, but in their depths, there was no threat. There was only a profound stillness, a raw power held in absolute check. This was not a man seeking shelter from a storm. This was a man who was one with it. Fear warred with something else inside her, something wild and reckless that rose to meet the storm in his eyes. He had saved her. He had watched over her. He was the enemy her people spoke of in hushed, fearful tones, but he was also the only man who had shown her anything other than contempt or avarice. Slowly, her fingers loosening their death grip on the rifle, she opened the door wider. He did not step inside. He remained on the threshold, a being of the wilderness, hesitating at the edge of civilization. He spoke a single word, his voice low and raspy, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had ever heard it. Water. The request was so simple, so fundamentally human. It shattered the last of her fear. He wasn't a spirit or a savage from a campfire tale. He was a man, thirsty. She nodded, unable to find her own voice. She leaned the rifle against the wall and turned to the water bucket. Her movement stiff. Her mind was a whirlwind. The chief of the Apache was on her porch, in the middle of the worst storm in a year, asking for a drink of water. The sheer impossibility of it made her feel as if she were in a dream. She filled a tin dipper, her hand shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim. When she turned back, he had taken a single step forward, just inside the doorway, out of the direct path of the rain. Water dripped from his hair onto the wooden floor, forming a small, dark puddle at his feet. The scent of wet earth, ozone, and something else, something uniquely his, wild and masculine, filled the small cabin, overwhelming the familiar smell of wood smoke and dried herbs. She held the dipper out to him. As he reached to take it, their fingers brushed. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. His skin was not cold from the rain, but searingly warm, a vibrant, living heat that seemed to radiate from his core. It was a touch that lasted less than a second, yet it branded itself onto her senses. She snatched her hand back as if she'd touched a hot coal, her heart hammering against her ribs. His jaw tightened, the only sign that he had felt it too. He took the dipper, his large hand enveloping it completely. He raised it to his lips and drank, his throat working. He never took his eyes off her. It was a gaze that stripped away every pretense, every societal rule, every fear. He saw her, not the grieving widow, not the stubborn rancher, not the town outcast. He saw the woman beneath, the one who lay awake in her empty bed, aching with a loneliness so profound it had become a part of her soul. And in his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own solitude. She saw the immense weight of leadership, the burden of a man who stood alone to protect his people. He was surrounded by his tribe, yet she sensed a loneliness in him that was as vast as the prairie itself. They were two solitary figures from opposing worlds, caught together in the eye of a storm, speaking a silent language of shared isolation. He finished the water and held the dipper out to her. This time, she was prepared. As she took it, she forced herself to meet his touch, to let her fingers linger for a heartbeat longer against his. It was a small act of defiance against the fear, against the world outside that would condemn them both for this simple moment. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of thanks, of acknowledgement. It said more than a dozen polite words ever could. He then took a step back, out onto the porch and into the driving rain. He gave her one last look, a look that held 1,000 unspoken questions and a single, unshakable certainty. Then he turned and walked away from the light, disappearing into the black, churning chaos of the storm, as if he were walking into his home. Ilara slowly closed the door, her body trembling from a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She slid the bar back into place, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet cabin. The storm still raged outside, but the real tempest was now inside her. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, the empty dipper still in her hand. The puddle of water on the floor where he had stood seemed to sizzle with energy. The cabin felt different, charged with his presence. She could still feel the phantom heat of his touch on her fingers, a warmth that spread through her veins, chasing away the chill of the night. The world was full of rules and prejudices, of lines drawn in the dust between white and Apache, between respectable and fallen. A widow was supposed to be in mourning, chaste and sorrowful. An Apache chief was supposed to be a faceless enemy, a threat to be eliminated. But in the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the storm, none of that had mattered. There had only been a man and a woman, and a spark that had leaped between them. Heedless of the consequences, she was afraid, more afraid than she had ever been in her life. But beneath the fear, a forbidden, long-dormant seed of desire had begun to stir. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 3, The Fire in the Shadows, asterisk, asterisk. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured and glistening. The air, washed clean of dust, smelled of damp earth and creosote. For Alara, it felt as though the storm had washed away a layer of her own weary resignation, leaving behind a raw and heightened awareness. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow cast by a passing cloud, made her heart quicken. She was no longer just waiting. She was watching. The silence of his absence was a tangible thing. For weeks, she saw no sign of him. The silhouette on the ridge did not return, but she knew he was there. It was a certainty that had settled deep in her bones, a low hum of energy at the edge of her perception. She'd find a single hawk feather placed on a fence post, its tip pointing away from the direction of a coming patrol. A pile of dry kindling, more than she had gathered herself, would appear near her woodpile. These were not gifts, but messages. They were Kale's silent language, telling her she was not alone. He was confessing, in his own way, that his watch over her was real and constant. The knowledge was both a profound comfort and a source of deep, unsettling turmoil. Her life, which had been a straightforward battle against grief and hardship, was now a complex landscape of forbidden emotions. During the day, she threw herself into her work with a frantic energy, her axe splitting logs with more force than necessary, her hands pulling weeds until her knuckles were raw. She was trying to exhaust the strange new life that thrummed within her. But the nights were her undoing. Sleep offered no escape. She would dream of dark, intense eyes and the feeling of a warm, calloused hand against hers. She would wake with a gasp, her body aching with a nameless longing that was sharp and undeniable. It was a physical hunger that left her breathless, a yearning for a presence to fill the vast, cold emptiness of her bed. Guilt was a bitter taste in her mouth. She felt she was betraying Jacob's memory, soiling the love they had shared. She would trace the initials JH he had carved into the bedpost, trying to summon his face, his gentle touch. But the image was fading, growing faint like a photograph left too long in the sun, replaced by a powerful, living presence that haunted her waking hours. This was a war within herself. One part of her, the woman raised on sermons of piety and strict social order, was horrified. Kale was an Apache, an enemy, a savage. According to every voice she had ever known, to feel this pull toward him was a sin, a betrayal of her people, her faith, her late husband. It was a path to ruin and damnation. But another part of her, a wilder, more honest part that had been awakened by the solitude of the prairie, felt differently. It was this part that recognized the honor in his silent protection. It was this part that had seen the man, not the warrior, standing drenched on her porch. It saw a strength that dwarfed the pathetic bullying of Sergeant Miller, a dignity that shamed the gossiping whispers of the townswomen. This part of her did not care about the color of his skin or the world he came from. It only knew that his gaze made her feel more alive than she had in years. It was a dangerous, thrilling, and terrifying realization. The conflict wasn't only hers. One evening, as the sun was setting, she saw him. He was not on the ridge this time, but closer, standing among a cluster of cottonwoods near the creek that marked her western boundary. He was not looking at her cabin. He was looking east, towards the distant lights of Redemption and the army outpost. She was hidden by the corner of the barn, and he did not see her. She watched him for a long time. The setting sun cast his face in sharp relief, and she could see the immense weight he carried. His jaw was set, the lines around his eyes etched with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. This was the burden of a leader. He was a man caught between two worlds, responsible for the lives of his people, whose lands were shrinking, whose way of life was being threatened with extinction by the very men she was supposed to call her own. She realized with a sudden, painful clarity that his desire to be near her, to protect her, was a profound risk for him. It was not just a matter of reputation, but of survival. A moment of distraction could cost his people dearly. This white woman was a weakness he could not afford, a threat to his focus and his duty. And yet, here he was. The knowledge of his own internal battle resonated with hers, creating a bond that transcended touch or words. The outside world, oblivious to their silent struggle, began to close in. The whispers in redemption had grown into a low, ugly rumor. She had been a fool to think Miller's encounter at her ranch would remain a secret. One of the corporals, his tongue loosened by whiskey at the saloon, had likely spoken of the Apache warrior who had appeared from the darkness. The story, twisted and embellished, had taken root in the fertile soil of the town's prejudice. On her next trip for supplies, the hostility was no longer veiled. No one would meet her eye. The clerk at the general store counted her change with a grimace, practically throwing the coins on the counter to avoid touching her hand. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, gathered her skirts and crossed the street as Alara approached, as if she were carrying a plague. Sergeant Miller was waiting for her outside, leaning against a post, a smug look on his face. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," he drawled, pushing himself upright. "Heard you've been entertaining." "I don't know what you're talking about," Alara said, her voice steady as she loaded her sacks onto Apollo's back. "Oh, I think you do," he said, stepping closer. "Strange tracks been seen out your way. Apache tracks. You'd be wise to remember which side you're on. Folks are starting to think you're a sympathizer, and we don't take kindly to sympathizers out here." His threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He was using the town's fear as a weapon against her, because he couldn't have her. He would see her destroyed. He made good on his threat. In the days that followed, the army patrols increased. They no longer stayed to the main trail, but rode the perimeter of her land, their blue uniforms a constant, menacing presence against the red earth. They were a cage, slowly being built around her. Their presence made the land feel smaller, more claustrophobic, and it made Kale's silent visits infinitely more dangerous. The tension between the settlers and the Apache stretched to a breaking point. A prospector was found dead miles to the north, an arrow in his back. No one knew who was responsible, but the Apache were blamed. Fear curdled into rage. The patrols became more aggressive, riding with their rifles unholstered, their eyes scanning the hills with open hostility. One afternoon, the danger became horrifyingly real. Alara was near the creek, checking a fence line, when she saw a glint of metal in the brush. It was a snare, crudely made, the kind a desperate trapper might set. But it was on her land. As she bent to examine it, she heard a low growl. She looked up and froze. Not 10 yards away, a mountain lion, its tawny body tensed and coiled, was emerging from the rocks. Its lip was curled back, revealing yellowed teeth. It had likely been drawn by the scent of the bait in the trap. Her rifle was back at the cabin. She had nothing but the small hatchet at her belt. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against the sudden, ringing silence of the prairie. She began to back away slowly, her eyes locked on the predator. The lion took a step forward, its tail twitching. It was going to charge. She braced herself, her hand gripping the hatchet. This was it. This was how it ended. And then, a sound like a whip crack cut through the air. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, appeared as if from nowhere and buried itself deep in the lion's shoulder. The beast let out a pained, furious roar and spun around, biting at the shaft. A second arrow followed instantly, striking it in the neck. The lion staggered, collapsed, and lay still. Alara stood, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling. She looked in the direction the arrows had come from. Kale stepped out from behind a tall saguaro, a bow in his hand. He moved with a fluid grace that was breathtaking, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky ground. He walked to the dead lion, his dark eyes assessing the kill with a practiced calm. He pulled his arrows free, wiping them clean on a handful of grass. Only then did he look at her. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but his anger was not directed at her. It was a cold, hard rage aimed at the unseen forces that had put her in this danger. He walked over to the snare and, with a single powerful stomp of his foot, crushed the mechanism. He then turned and walked towards her. He stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with his controlled breaths. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His actions had said everything. I am here. I am watching. I will protect you. She could only stare at him, her heart filled with a terrifying, overwhelming gratitude. In that moment, the war inside her ceased. The rules of her world, the prejudices, the fears, they all fell away, meaningless in the face of this powerful, undeniable truth. He had just saved her life. He held her gaze, and she saw the conflict in his eyes, the fierce battle between his duty and this inexplicable pull that bound them. His hand clenched and unclenched at his side, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with a desperate, impossible longing. A distant shout echoed from the east. A patrol. Cale's expression hardened. He gave her one last, intense look, a look that was both a warning and a promise, and then he was gone. He melted back into the landscape, leaving her alone with the dead lion and the 2 arrows that had saved her life. The fire that had been smoldering in the darkness between them had been fanned by the winds of danger, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it would soon be too powerful to hide. *******. Part 4. Your bed looks too big *****. The nights had become a siege. The increased patrols meant Alara's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of her cabin and the small patch of land she could survey from her window. The soldiers were a constant, grim reminder of the cage that was closing around her. They were Miller's eyes and ears, and their presence choked the air, making it thin and hard to breathe. Fear was a constant companion, but it was no longer just for herself. Now, she feared for Cale. Every snap of a twig, every distant coyote's call, sent a jolt of panic through her. She searched the familiar ridges for his silhouette, but he was gone, erased by the heightened danger. His absence was an ache, a hollowness that the fear could not fill. The memory of him standing over the dead lion, his face a mask of cold fury on her behalf, was burned into her mind. He had saved her, and in doing so, had bound her to him with an invisible cord of gratitude and a longing that was becoming unbearable. The war inside her was over. She had chosen a side, and it was his. She would rather face the judgment of the world than return to the gray, lifeless solitude she had known before. Tonight, the moon was a sliver, offering little light. The prairie was a vast inkwell of darkness, and the silence was heavy, watchful. Alara had finished her chores, her movements purely mechanical. She sat at her small wooden table, a book open before her, though she hadn't turned a page in an hour. Her ears were strained, listening for the sound of hoofbeats, for the telltale jingle of a soldier's gear. She was listening for a danger she could name, while her heart was waiting for a presence she could not. There was no knock. The latch on the door lifted with a soft, metallic click. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening a darker rectangle in the cabin's dim light, and he was there. Cale stood on the threshold, not as a visitor seeking shelter from a storm, but as a man who had reached a decision. He was no longer a shadow at the edge of her world. He was stepping deliberately into its center. He brought the scent of the cool night air with him, of sage and dust and wildness. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, found hers instantly in the lamplight, and they held an unnerving intensity. He had come past the patrols, risked being seen, risked everything, to be here. He took a step inside, and another, his presence seeming to fill the small cabin, diminishing everything else to insignificance. The space felt charged, the air thick with all the things that had gone unsaid between them for months. He closed the door behind him, the soft thud of the wood slotting into its frame, shutting out the rest of the world. It was a sound of finality. He stopped a few feet from her table. He was unarmed, his powerful chest bare, his buckskin leggings hugging the lean muscle of his thighs. He looked tired, the lines of responsibility on his face carved deeper than she had ever seen them. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a fierce, unyielding resolve. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that was felt as much as it was heard. "Can I stay tonight?" The question was simple, yet it held the weight of a lifetime. It was not about shelter. It was not just about this one night. It was a question about loyalty, about desire, about crossing the uncrossable chasm that separated their two worlds. To say yes was to abandon all hope of safety, to embrace the path of the outcast. To say no was to deny the only thing that had made her feel truly alive since Jacob's death. Her breath caught in her throat. The book slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. She rose slowly from her chair, her legs unsteady. The lamplight cast a warm glow on his coppery skin, highlighting the stark planes of his face. She looked at him, this powerful, solitary man, a chief to his people, a specter to hers, a being who seemed to carry the entire weight of the wilderness within him. Then her gaze drifted past him, to the simple bed in the corner of the room, her bed, the one Jacob had built, the one she had slept in alone for 2 long years. It was large, meant for 2, and its emptiness had been a constant, nightly rebuke. Seeing Cale standing here, so vibrantly alive in the same small space, made the emptiness of that bed seem like a physical wound. She thought of his life, sleeping on the hard ground under a blanket of stars, always watchful, always alone. A shiver, born of cold fear and a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy, traced its way down her spine. Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile thread of sound in the charged silence. She was projecting all of her own loneliness, all of her own ache, onto him. "Your bed looks too big," she shivered. He understood instantly. He knew she wasn't talking about a bedroll under the stars. She was talking about the space beside her. She was speaking the secret language of the lonely, a language they both knew by heart. The harsh lines of his face softened. A slow smile touched his lips, a smile that was not gentle, but fierce and possessive and filled with a profound, soul-deep affirmation. He closed the remaining distance between them in 2 long, silent strides. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He didn't look at her face. His dark, intense gaze went to the bed in the corner. He looked back at her, his eyes holding hers captive. His voice was a low, intimate growl, a promise that sent a tremor of pure sensation through her. "It fits perfect when you're in it." And that was it. The last wall of her resistance crumbled into dust. He raised a hand, not to grab or to take, but with a reverence that made her want to weep. His calloused fingers gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. The touch was electric, a jolt of lightning that lit up every nerve in her body. She leaned into his palm, a silent surrender, her eyes fluttering closed. All the tension, all the fear she had carried for months, began to drain away, replaced by a feeling of rightness so powerful it was dizzying. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of long-suppressed hunger and deep, aching recognition. It was demanding yet tender, a raw claiming that was also a homecoming. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, wanting to erase the last fraction of an inch that separated them. This was no longer about a lonely widow and an Apache chief. This was about Alara and Kale. As he lifted her into his arms, her legs wrapping around his waist as if by instinct, she felt a profound transformation. The weight of her grief, the shame of her secret desires, the armor of the self-sufficient rancher, it all fell away. In his arms, she was not a widow defined by loss, but a woman defined by this overwhelming, living desire. She was wanted. He carried her to the bed and laid her down gently, in the soft lamplight. Their eyes remained locked as they shed the clothes that marked them as members of opposing worlds. The buckskin and the worn gingham were discarded, meaningless barriers between the truth of their skin. His body was a masterpiece of lean, hard muscle, scarred and beautiful, a testament to a life of hardship and strength. When he finally came to her, it was a union of storms, a collision of two solitudes. It was fierce and primal, a desperate slaking of a thirst they hadn't known how to name, but threaded through the raw intensity was a startling tenderness. The way his hands roamed her body was not with the roughness of a conqueror, but with the careful exploration of a man discovering a precious, long-sought treasure. For Alara, it was a reawakening. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word in his native tongue was a reclamation of a part of herself she thought had died with Jacob. He showed her that her body was not just a vessel for grief, but a source of profound pleasure, a living thing capable of an incandescent joy. And as they lay tangled together in the aftermath, their bodies slick with sweat, their breaths mingling in the quiet dark, she knew their world had been irrevocably altered. They had done more than satisfy a physical need. They had made a silent, binding declaration. In a world that demanded they be enemies, they had chosen each other. They had chosen this stolen, desperate, beautiful connection over the safety of fear. The fire that had been smoldering in the shadows had finally been brought into the light, and its flames, she knew, would either guide them or consume them completely. ###****, Part V, Morning's Breath, ****. Ilara woke to a foreign sensation warmth. For 2 years, she had woken to the cold, empty space beside her, a constant, chilling reminder of her loss. But this morning, she was cocooned in a powerful embrace, her back pressed against a wall of living, breathing heat. An arm, heavy with muscle, was draped possessively over her waist. The scent of him of night air, pine, and warm skin filled her senses, a scent more intoxicating than any memory. She lay perfectly still, memorizing the feeling, the quiet rhythm of his breathing, the solid reality of him. A slow, spreading happiness, so pure and potent it almost hurt, bloomed in her chest. Then, the first pale finger of dawn light crept through a crack in the shutters. It sliced across the dark cabin, illuminating a floating swirl of dust motes. And with it came the world. The happiness in her chest was joined by a cold, coiling serpent of anxiety. The night had been their sanctuary, a world of two that existed outside of time and consequence. But the morning was coming, and the morning brought soldiers, patrols, and the unforgiving judgment of the sun. Kale stirred beside her, his body tensing as he transitioned from the quiet depths of sleep to the sharp alertness of a man who lived on a razor's edge. He did not open his eyes immediately, but she felt the change in him. The relaxed lover was gone, replaced by the warrior, the chief. When he did open his eyes, they were clear and focused, and in their dark depths, she saw the reflection of her own fear, magnified by the weight of his own immense responsibilities. He looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his gaze softened. He raised a hand and gently pushed a stray strand of hair from her face. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible beauty and the equally impossible danger of what they had done. "I must go," he said, his voice a low rasp in the quiet room. "I know." The words were a painful whisper. He moved with a fluid, silent grace. Rising from the bed and dressing in the semi-darkness, she watched him, her heart aching. The sight of his scarred, powerful back as he pulled on his buckskin leggings was a vision of both strength and vulnerability. He was a leader who had allowed himself a moment of personal solace, and now the price of that moment was coming due. He paused at the door, turning back to her. The look on his face was grim, a mask of resolve that couldn't quite hide the conflict raging within him. He knew, as she did, that this could not remain their secret. A line had been crossed, and the world would not suffer it to exist in peace. He gave a single, sharp nod, a promise to return and a warning of the perils to come, and then slipped out into the pre-dawn gray, vanishing as completely as a mountain lion into the brush. The cabin, which had felt so wonderfully, dangerously full just moments before, was now cavernously empty. The lingering scent of him was a cruel ghost. Elara dressed, her movements slow, her body both wonderfully sore and deeply energized. She went about her morning chores with a strange, dual awareness. She saw the world through new eyes. The crimson blush of the sunrise on the mesas was more vibrant, the call of a distant hawk sharper, but layered over this new beauty was a constant, thrumming dread. When a patrol of 4 soldiers rode past, much closer to her cabin than usual, she had to grip the handle of the water pump until her knuckles turned white to keep from running inside. They stared at the cabin, their faces impassive, but their eyes sweeping, searching. She met their gazes with a placid expression she did not feel, offering a slight, dismissive nod as a proper widow should, until they finally rode on. The encounter left her trembling, the blissful memory of the night clashing violently with the harsh reality of the day. A few days later, her supplies dangerously low, she had no choice but to ride into redemption. The 10-mile journey felt like 100. The town, once merely a place of judgment, now felt like enemy territory. As she tied Apollo to the hitching post, she could feel the eyes on her. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a low, hostile murmur. Windows that had been open were shuttered. The blacksmith, who used to offer a gruff but civil greeting, now pointedly turned his back to his anvil, hammering a piece of iron with furious, pointed blows. Inside the general store, the air was thick with condemnation. Mrs. Gable stood with 2 other townswomen, their backs ramrod straight, their faces pinched with righteous indignation. They fell silent as Elara entered, their collective glare a physical force. "Some people," Mrs. Gable said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear, "have forgotten their Christian decency. They forget the sanctity of their marriage vows and the memory of their good husbands." She looked directly at Elara. "And they forget the mortal danger of lying down with the devil. The good book is very clear about the fate of those who cavort with heathens. Their sin stains us all." Elara's face burned, but she refused to look away. She met the preacher's wife's hateful stare with a cool defiance that surprised even herself. The lonely, grieving widow would have shrunk from such a confrontation. But the woman who had held Cale in her arms was different. She was no longer just surviving. She had something to fight for. She gathered her flour and salt, paid the grim-faced clerk, and walked out of the store with her head held high, the women's venomous silence following her out the door. The ordeal was not over. Sergeant Miller was waiting, blocking her path to her horse. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "you're looking flushed. Must be the heat. Move aside." "Sergeant," she said, her voice low and even. His eyes, cold and assessing, roamed over her, and there was a knowing, ugly glint in them. "I'm a patient man, but my patience is wearing thin. This is a decent, God-fearing territory. We don't have room for Apache lovers here. Sooner or later, your protector will make a mistake, and when he does, I'll be waiting." He stepped aside then, a cruel smile playing on his lips. As Elara mounted Apollo and rode away, she felt his gaze on her back like a physical weight. He knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew. He was no longer just a bully, he was a hunter, and he had chosen his prey. The burden was not only hers to bear, The next afternoon, seeking the relative peace of the creek at the edge of her property, she saw a gathering on the high mesa across the border of her land. It was Kale, and with him were 5 of his warriors. They were too far away to be heard, but their postures spoke a clear, violent language of dissent. One warrior in particular, a tall, powerfully built man with a fearsome scowl, stood face to face with Kale. He gestured angrily, first towards Alara's ranch, then back towards the mountains where their people were hidden. It was a clear accusation. The other warriors stood silently, their arms crossed, their faces grim and unreadable. They were watching their chief, their loyalty being tested. Alara's heart went cold. They believed Kale's judgment was being clouded. They saw her, the white woman, as a weakness, a siren call luring their leader to his doom and endangering them all. Kale stood perfectly still, his back to her, absorbing the man's tirade without a word. He was an unmovable rock against which his warrior's anger crashed. When the man was finished, Kale spoke, his gestures calm and deliberate, but a palpable tension radiated from the group. He was facing a rebellion born from fear and prejudice, the very same forces she faced in redemption. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts against the white soldiers who wanted to exterminate his people, and against the doubt that was poisoning them from within. And she, Alara, was the cause. She retreated before they could see her, a devastating guilt settling upon her. The breath of mourning, which had been so full of hope and happiness, had turned into a suffocating shroud of consequence. Their single night of truth and passion had drawn a battle line not just between them and the world, but within their own worlds as well. He was being weakened in the eyes of his tribe, and she was being branded a pariah in hers. The sanctuary of the cabin felt 1,000 miles away, a beautiful, impossible dream. The reality was the cold, hard ground of a war they could not possibly win. ###***, Part 6, Between Two Worlds, ****. The cabin had become a paradox. It was Alara's only sanctuary, the one place on earth where she could breathe freely. Her heart filled with the warm, lingering memory of Kale's presence. The scent of him seemed to have permanently infused the rough-hewn wooden walls. Here, she could almost believe in a world where their love was not a declaration of war. But the moment she looked out the window, the illusion shattered. Miller's patrols were a constant, circling threat, their blue uniforms a stark violation against the red earth. They were a physical manifestation of the world's judgment, penning her in, turning her dream of a peaceful home into a gilded cage. Her isolation was now absolute. The last vestiges of her connection to redemption had been severed. She was an island, and the sea that surrounded her was filled with sharks. This new reality forced a question, sharp and relentless, that echoed in the lonely hours of the night. Was this love worth the cost? She would run her fingers over the initials Jacob had carved into the bedpost, the letters worn smooth with time. The love she had shared with him had been simple, approved of by God and society. It had been a safe harbor. The love she felt for Kale was a raging storm, a force of nature that threatened to tear down everything it touched. She thought of the anger on the face of his warrior, Taza. She thought of the burden she had seen in Kale's eyes. Was her need for him a selfish indulgence that was jeopardizing his leadership, his honor, his very life? The guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. She was a danger to him, a white woman's poison seeping into the heart of the Apache people. To love him was to betray her own world. To be loved by him was to ask him to betray his. They were both traitors, branded by a love that neither of their societies could ever comprehend or forgive. He came to her a week later, long after the moon had set, moving through the darkness like a phantom. She had left the window unlatched, a silent invitation and a prayer. He slipped inside without a sound, and the first she knew of his presence was the feel of his hand gently covering her mouth as she slept, a gesture to prevent a startled cry. "It is I," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. She turned in his arms, her heart leaping with a joy so fierce it was painful. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw a fresh, deep cut along his cheekbone and a dark bruising on his ribs. "What happened?" she breathed, her fingers tracing the line of the wound. He caught her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "An argument with a brother," he said, his voice flat. He offered no more details, but she knew. It was Taza. The dissent in his tribe was no longer just words. It had turned to blows. He had fought his own warrior, a rift torn in the fabric of his people. Because of her. The stone of guilt in her stomach grew heavier. "And you?" he asked, his gaze intense, searching her face in the gloom. "The soldiers." "They watch," she said simply. "Miller knows. He is waiting for you to make a mistake." They stood in the center of the small cabin, the silence between them thick with the crushing weight of their reality. They were the enemy to each other's people. And here, in this small pocket of defiance, they were the only allies they had. He had risked his life and his authority to come to her. She had risked ostracization and violence to welcome him. The question of whether it was worth it hung in the air, a terrible, unspoken thing. He gave her his answer, not in words, but in action. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was nothing like the first time. The initial, joyous discovery was gone, replaced by a desperate, almost brutal urgency. This was not the kiss of a lover confident in his possession. It was the kiss of a man clinging to his only source of light in a world of encroaching darkness. It tasted of risk, of loss, and of a defiance so profound it bordered on madness. She responded with equal fervor, her hands gripping his shoulders, her body molding against his. This was their true language now, in a world that had taken everything from them. This was the one thing they could claim. Their passion was a frantic attempt to burn away the fear, to create a moment so intense it could eclipse the hostile reality waiting for them outside the cabin door. Every touch was a stolen treasure, every shared breath a rebellion. They were stealing time from the storm, and they both knew the storm was coming. Later, as they lay under the thin blanket, their bodies still humming with the aftershocks of their passion, he spoke, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "This house," he said, his gaze sweeping the shadowy confines of the room. "It is a strong house. The wood is good." Ilara looked around at the familiar walls, the simple furniture, the sturdy ceiling that had kept out so many storms. It was Jacob's dream, and it had become hers. A small piece of the world to call their own, a place to build a life, a place of peace. "It is all I have left of that life," she whispered. Kale was silent for a long moment. "A dream of peace is a dangerous thing in a land at war," he said, his voice heavy with an ancient sorrow. She understood his meaning. The cabin was not a fortress. It was a target. Its very existence, her defiant solitude within it, drew the eyes of men like Miller. And now, with him here, it had become the epicenter of a conflict that would inevitably erupt into violence. The symbol of her peaceful dream was now the most dangerous place either of them could be. He held her tighter, a protective, desperate gesture. "I asked you if this love was worth the price," she confessed into his shoulder, the words she had wrestled with alone in the dark. He did not answer right away. He simply held her, his hand stroking her hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "There is no price," he said. "There is only this. Everything else is the war. This is the reason to fight it." In that moment, her own internal war ended for good. His words were an absolution. He was not a chief weakened by a woman. He was a man strengthened by a reason to live beyond mere survival. And she was not a traitor to her past. She was a woman choosing a future, however perilous it might be. They had both faced the question of their own loyalties, and they had found the answer in each other. He left her as he always did, before the first hint of dawn, a shadow slipping back into a world of shadows. As the sun rose, Alara stood by the window, watching the familiar landscape take shape. But it looked different now. She was no longer a victim, waiting for the world to decide her fate. She was a combatant. Her loyalty was no longer to a memory, or to a society that had cast her out. Her loyalty was to the man who walked between two worlds, the man who was willing to risk everything for the sanctuary of her arms. The cabin was no longer a cage, and it was no longer just a dream of peace. It was a battlefield, and she would defend it and him with her last breath. *******, Part 7, The Frontier Storm, *****. The air itself had turned against them. For days, an oppressive stillness held the prairie in its grip, the heat baking the land until the horizon shimmered with mirages. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for a final, violent exhalation. Kale had not come. The danger was too acute, the patrols too frequent and unpredictable. Alara knew his absence was a measure of his care, a strategic withdrawal to protect her. But it did little to soothe the frantic, frightened bird that beat its wings against her ribs. Every sound was magnified: the creak of a floorboard, the lowing of a nervous steer, the whisper of the wind around the eaves of the cabin. She was a prisoner in her own home, and the walls felt as if they were closing in. Sergeant Miller's threat had not been idle. She felt his eyes on her even when he wasn't there, the weight of his suspicion a tangible presence. She knew the tense quiet could not last. A storm was coming, a storm of men, and it would be far more destructive than any cloudburst. It came in the brutal heat of the late afternoon. She was inside, mending a torn shirt, when she heard it, not the familiar rhythm of a four-man patrol, but the heavy, chaotic drumming of more than a dozen horses, ridden hard. She dropped the shirt and ran to the window, her heart seizing in her chest. A thick plume of red dust rose on the trail from Redemption, a grim signal of the approaching horde. It was Miller, as she knew it would be. He rode at the head of the posse, his face set in a mask of righteous fury. But he was not alone. Behind him rode a grim collection of men from the town, the blacksmith. His heavy arms crossed over his chest. The clerk from the general store, his face pale and pinched. Two ranchers from the north whose land bordered Apache territory. They were not soldiers. They were a mob, their fear and prejudice stoked into a righteous flame by Miller's whispers. They carried rifles across their saddles and a cold, hard certainty in their eyes. In the thicket of cottonwoods and mesquite that overlooked the ranch from the west, Kale went utterly still. He had been watching the trail, a knot of unease tightening in his gut all day. He saw the dust cloud long before he could make out the riders. When he saw who they were, a cold, lethal rage settled over him. This was not a patrol. This was an execution party. He melted back from the edge of the ridge, his movements as silent and fluid as a stalking panther. He found a position behind a cluster of red rocks, a spot that gave him a clear view of the cabin's porch while keeping him completely concealed. He slid an arrow from the quiver on his back, the smooth, worn wood familiar in his hand. He knocked it to his bowstring, the motion practiced and economical. His breath was a slow, controlled whisper in his chest. His world narrowed to the point of that obsidian arrowhead and the scene unfolding below. Alara did not reach for her rifle. She knew, with chilling certainty, that any sign of aggression would be the only excuse they needed. She smoothed her apron, took a single, deep breath to steady her hammering heart, and opened the door. She stepped out onto the porch and stood there, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, waiting. The posse reined in, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust, surrounding the small cabin. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and animosity. "Afternoon. Mrs. Hayes," Miller said, his voice ringing with false civility. He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling. We've come on official business." "What business could you possibly have here?" Sergeant Alara's voice was calm, betraying none of the terror that was screaming through her veins. "We have reliable information," Miller announced, his voice rising for the benefit of the men behind him, "that you have been consorting with the enemy, that you've been harboring a murderous Apache fugitive on this property." From his hiding place, Cale's fingers tightened on the bowstring. Murderous fugitive. The white man's words were poison, designed to strip him of his humanity, to turn him into a beast that needed to be put down. He watched Alara, a fierce, protective ache in his chest. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, though her voice was as steady as a rock. "I am a widow living alone." "Sergeant," she said, her eyes meeting his without flinching, "there is no one here but me. You are chasing shadows." She then looked past him, at the grim-faced townsman. "All of you. There is nothing for you here." Her gaze was not pleading, but firm, an appeal to the decency she prayed still existed somewhere beneath their fear. Miller chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "We'll be the judge of that. We're going to search this place from top to bottom. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear." "You will not," she said, her voice dropping to a level of cold command. She took a step forward, to the top of the porch steps, physically blocking the entrance to her home. "You have no warrant, no right. This is my home." "This is United States territory," Madam Miller roared, his face purpling. "And I have the right to root out any threat to its citizens." He gestured to two of his men. "Search the barn. You two, the corral, the rest of you. With me." He started up the steps, but Alara did not move. She stood her ground, a lone woman against a tide of armed men, her body a fragile but unyielding shield protecting the sanctity of her home and the secret within it. "I am telling you," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the tense silence. "You will find nothing here." For a moment, it seemed Miller might strike her. His hand twitched towards his sidearm, behind the rocks. Cale drew the bowstring back to his cheek, the sinew creaking softly. The world slowed, the distance to Miller's heart, the flight of the arrow, the chaos that would follow. He saw it all in a fraction of a second. He saw Alara, caught in the crossfire. He saw her fall. And he knew he could not let that happen. He would wait. He would let them violate her home, but he would not let them harm her. If a single one of them laid a hand on her, the rocks would run red with their blood. Miller seemed to think better of it. Shoving a woman in front of the whole town was not the image he wanted. With a snarl, he pushed past her, his shoulder knocking hers, and stormed into the cabin. The townsmen followed, their boots heavy and clumsy on the wooden floors. The violation was brutal and swift. They were not searching, they were destroying. They overturned her small table, sending her books and tin plates crashing to the floor. They ripped the blankets from her bed, tossing the mattress aside. They emptied her flour and sugar onto the floor, looking for a hidden compartment. It was an act of pure, vindictive rage. Alara stood on the porch, her back rigid, listening to the destruction of her life. She did not cry. She did not scream. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask. She stared out at the red mountains, her gaze distant, as if she had already left this place behind. The men outside were equally fruitless. They found nothing in the barn but a nervous horse. They found no tracks near the corral but hers and the cattle's. Cale, a creature of the wilderness, knew how to move without leaving a trace, how to exist in a place without marking it. After 15 minutes, Miller and the others stomped back out of the cabin, their faces dark with frustration. They had found nothing. No extra bedroll, no man's clothing, no Apache weapons, nothing. "He was here," Miller hissed, his face close to Alara's. "I can smell him on this place." "All you can smell, Sergeant, is your own failure," Alara said, her voice devoid of all emotion. The lack of evidence had not proven her innocence. In their eyes, it had only proven her cunning. It was a confirmation of her guilt. She had outsmarted them, and they hated her for it. The suspicion had now hardened into an unspoken sentence. Miller stared at her for a long, venomous moment, his eyes promising a future of misery. "This isn't over," he spat. He turned to the other men. "Let's go." They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, desecrated silence behind them. Alara stood motionless on the porch until they were completely out of sight. Only then did her body begin to tremble, not from fear, but from a rage so deep it threatened to consume her. She walked back into her home and stared at the wreckage. This had been her sanctuary, her dream. Now it was just a house, a pile of wood and broken things. They had not found Cale, but they had succeeded in destroying her world all the same. Night fell, and with it, a cold, heavy despair. She did not light the lantern. She sat in the darkness, amidst the ruins, feeling the last vestiges of her old life bleeding away. He came when the darkness was at its deepest. He slipped through the door, a shadow moving within shadows. He knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. He had seen everything. He had felt every moment of her humiliation, her defiance, her pain. He had held back, an act of restraint that had cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. He looked around at the shambles of her home, then back at her face. Pale in the thin moonlight, the time for hiding, for stealing moments, was over. The world had made its choice, and now they had to make theirs. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a lover, but of a chieftain making a final, absolute decree. It was a voice that carried the weight of life and death. "This cannot stay hidden," he said, his grip on her hands tightening. He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw a fire in them she had never seen before, a possessiveness that was both terrifying and thrilling. "You are mine." He paused, letting the words settle in the broken silence of the room. It was not a question of her love, but a statement of his responsibility. He had brought this storm upon her, and he would see her through it. "I take you with me." It was not a request. It was the only path forward, a journey into a future more dangerous and uncertain than anything she could imagine. He was asking her to abandon everything, this land, this house, the last ghost of the woman she used to be. She looked at his face, at the fresh cut on his cheek, at the unyielding strength in his jaw. She looked at the wreckage of her home, a testament to the hatred of one world. And she looked at the man who offered her another, a world of loyalty, of fierce love, of belonging not to a place, but to a person. There was no choice to be made. There was only the truth. "Yes," she whispered into the darkness. "Take me with you." ###****, part Sade T, the path to the horizon, ****. There was no hesitation. Her yes was not a surrender to fate, but a seizing of it. In the wreckage of her home, a new, unshakable clarity was born. The life she had known was over, shattered not by Cale, but by the very people who claimed to be her own. There was nothing left to mourn. Cale rose and took her hand, pulling her to her feet. "We leave now," he said, his voice urgent. "Before the sun returns, Miller will not let this rest." "What do I take?" she asked, looking around at the chaos. Her possessions were few and now mostly ruined. "Only what you cannot live without," he answered, his gaze telling her he already knew the answer. She walked to the small, overturned chest at the foot of her bed. From it, she took a single object, a small, faded daguerreotype of her parents, its silver surface cool against her palm. She tucked it into the pocket of her dress. Then she went to the hearth and took down the rifle. It had been Jacob's, but it was hers now, a tool for survival. That was all. She left the torn shirts, the broken plates, the spilled flour. She left the ghosts and the memories and the woman who had cried herself to sleep in the big, empty bed. When she turned back to him, holding only the rifle. He nodded in understanding. He led her to the door, pausing on the threshold. She took one last look at the cabin. It was not a home anymore. It was a grave marker for a life that was no longer hers. She felt a pang, not of sadness, but of a grim finality. She turned her back on it and did not look back. Outside, the night was cool and deep. Another horse, a sturdy pinto, stood waiting beside Apollo. It was saddled with a simple Apache pad. Apollo whinnied softly, nudging her hand. A wave of pain, sharp and real, went through her. The horse was her last living link to her past. "He cannot make the journey where we are going," Cale said gently, understanding her silent grief. "The trail is too hard." She knew he was right. She pressed her face into Apollo's neck, breathing in his familiar, comforting scent. "Go on, boy," she whispered, her voice thick. She unlatched the corral gate and gave him a firm slap on the rump. "Be free." The horse hesitated, then trotted out into the darkness, a shadow returning to the wild. The act was a final, painful severing of her ties to this land. Cale helped her onto the pinto, his hands strong and steady on her waist. He swung up onto his own mount, a powerful black stallion that seemed carved from the night itself. He took the pinto's lead rope, and without another word, they moved off. Not towards the east and the world of men, but west, into the jagged, unforgiving heart of Apache territory. The journey was a dream of motion and darkness. They moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving. Cale navigated the treacherous, moonless landscape as if it were a sunlit room, his knowledge of the land absolute. They forded shallow streams, climbed rocky inclines, and slipped through narrow canyons whose walls rose up on either side like ancient, sleeping giants. Elara held on to the saddle, her body aching, the rifle held tight across her lap. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, a snake, a predator, or worse, one of Miller's patrols, but with Cale riding just ahead of her, a silent, indomitable silhouette against the star-dusted sky. The fear was manageable. He was her compass, her shield. She had placed her life entirely in his hands, an act of faith more profound than any prayer she had ever uttered in church. As the night wore on, the landscape grew wilder, more alien. The flat prairie gave way to a labyrinth of canyons and mesas, a fortress of stone and shadow. This was his world, a world that did not welcome outsiders. She knew what she was riding into. She would be an object of suspicion, of hatred. A white woman in an Apache camp was a symbol of their enemy, a walking wound. Her love for Cale would not be enough to protect her from the scorn of his people. She would have to earn her place, if such a place even existed. But the choice was made. It was better to fight for a place in his world than to be slowly crushed to death by her own. Just as the eastern sky began to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple, Cale reined in. They were on a high ridge, overlooking a hidden valley. Below, sheltered by the surrounding cliffs, was a collection of wickiups, the dome-shaped dwellings of the Apache. A thin curl of smoke rose from a central fire, the only sign of life. This was it, the rancheria, his home. "They will not welcome you," Cale said, his voice low and grim, his eyes fixed on the camp below. He was not warning her. He was preparing her. "They see your people as the source of all our pain. They will see you as a danger."
"And you?"
she asked, her voice quiet.
"What do you see?"
He turned to her, and in the faint, pre-dawn light, she saw the fierce, unwavering certainty in his eyes. "I see my woman," he said. The words were a brand, a claim, and a vow. He urged his horse forward, leading her down the steep, narrow path into the valley. As they approached, the camp began to stir. Figures emerged from the wickiups, their faces turning towards the riders. A silence fell over the small community. a silence of shock and deep suspicion. She could feel their eyes on her, hundreds of them, burning with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. She saw Taza, Kale's warrior, step forward from the crowd. His face was a thundercloud of rage and disbelief. He stared at Alara as if she were a ghost, an evil spirit his chief had foolishly brought into their midst. Other warriors gathered behind him, their hands resting on the knives at their belts. Kale did not falter. He rode directly to the center of the camp and dismounted. The entire tribe watched as he turned and held his arms up to Alara. She swung her leg over the saddle and slid into his grasp. He did not set her down immediately. He held her for a moment, his arm firmly around her waist, forcing his people to see. This was not a captive. This was not a prize of war. This was his chosen partner. He set her gently on her feet, and she stood beside him, her back straight, her chin held high. She clutched the rifle, her only piece of the world she had left behind, and met the hostile stares of the Apache people. She was terrified, but she would not let them see it. She had shown steel to Miller. She would show it to them. Her life depended on it. Kale turned to face Taza, his expression unreadable, his authority an invisible cloak around him. The two men locked gazes. A silent battle of wills waged in the heart of the camp. It was a confrontation between the past and a new, uncertain future. At that moment, the first ray of sunlight broke over the eastern mesa. It crested the cliffs and spilled into the hidden valley, a wave of brilliant, rose-gold light. It struck Alara and Kale from behind, outlining their two figures in fire. The long, dark night of their journey was over. The world of shadows and stolen moments was gone. They stood together, a renegade chief and his white woman, traitors to both their worlds. With no home but each other, they had chosen this path, a life not of quiet desperation, but of dangerous, brilliant, and defiant love. The world would likely never forgive them, but as they stood facing their new, uncertain life, bathed in the light of the rising sun, they were not asking for forgiveness, they were claiming their dawn. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners like you, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world.